VP.com. Let's get to our first headline of the day. It has to do with one Kamala Harris. And this one coming from the Hill. It says Harris's bad polls trigger Democratic worries. This headline kind of grabbed my attention today whenever I saw it. Not that it was particularly explosive in the other, sort of methods and modes of things that are being discussed in politics right now. There's a big discussion about an infrastructure bill. It seems like it's a big discussion because it is. As I mentioned on the show yesterday, it's pretty boring talk whenever you talk about infrastructure bills and things like that. It's going to pass. It's just a matter of how much money. But this is something I think within the headlines that we ought to be paying attention to because VP Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, is up next. I think no matter which way you slice and dice this cake, you got to view Kamala Harris as kind of up next for the Democrats. That's, I guess, an okay thing, but it's not a very great thing. I've always argued that that's not a very great thing. I'm happy for Kamala Harris, and the heights that she's been able to achieve in politics. And sometimes you reach a particular height in politics not based upon merit, not based upon how awesome you were or how great of a representative you were. Sometimes you got to be the hot thing. You look at Barack Obama, for example, not that I'm comparing the two, but you look at Barack Obama, for example, he was a senator in Illinois, for like 2 seconds before he was president. And I was just talking with somebody about this the other day. Him being a senator, Barack Obama being a senator, was really just a stepping stone to him being president. Like, it was really never about him being an effective. The Democrats never, didn't really have this grand plan, if you will, to make Barack Obama the most awesome Illinois senator, right? Like, it was like Barack Obama's next up. We see this. We want to elevate this guy. By the time 2006 came back around, or 2006 came around, they were like, this is our guy. We're not going to put our weight behind him just yet, but this is the star. Who is that for the Democrats? It would make sense if you say Kamala Harris. She's vice president to a president that's also very old right now, that a president that will be more than 83 years old the next time he's sworn in as president, if he decides to go that route. And so you might think that the Democratic Party, which is focused on somewhat of a future here, might have a vested interest in ensuring that the number 2 person in line is ready to go. So far, 6 months into this administration, it has not been that for one Kamala Harris. According to this article, a trio of recent surveys says that Harris earned a combined unfavorable rating of 46%, according to an aggregate average compiled by Real Clear Politics. Unfavorability of 46% is kind of high. It's not like hatred high, but it is certainly not what you were looking for out of the gate from Kamala Harris. I think especially if you're the Democrats who want to see this, see this person kind of take off. She wasn't really tremendously popular as a senator in California, and I think that's really where we have to start this discussion, because we can go in a number of different directions. She's so diverse, right? Like, the Democrat Party and the media in general was so thrilled at this idea that Kamala Harris represents this almost like quadruple minority of things, that, there are all these, positives that go behind having the first, female vice president. There's a lot that we can celebrate about that kind of thing. But what seemed to be sort of smoothed over in that conversation is that, like, does anybody actually like Kamala Harris? I mean, being a vice president is somewhat a position of the people. You don't exactly have the kind of legislative power that the president does, although under emergencies, I guess you do. But, in general, you just kind of hang out for 4 years. You mingle with the people. You make the job for the president much easier. And for the type of person that at least I knew Kamala Harris to be before she was, thrust into this VP role, it didn't really seem like she would be great at those kind of things. Just me. Just saying. Anyway, she found herself there because of a promise that Joe Biden made. Of course, you guys might remember this before the election. There were so many things happening last year that it's easy to forget that Joe Biden promised everybody that his running mate, after he secured the Democratic nomination, his running mate was going to be a woman. And then he went further to say that it was going to be a woman of color. another sort of progressive step in this whole process that a lot of people applauded. They saw this as a very much so as a positive. And I appreciated Biden for sort of making diversity an action step instead of just a policy platform. I admire when that actually happens. However, he did back himself into a corner here because the Democrat Party had not prepared itself for this moment where it could reach into its bag full of qualified African-American female candidates and pull one out that would be perfect just for this moment. Certainly, the Democrats represented the party that is all for that kind of thing. I'm down with it, right? But they still weren't really prepared for that moment. And so Biden takes this commitment, the party takes this commitment, and Kamala Harris sort of rises to the top as the best overall option given the scenario, given the circumstances. The idea that Biden can't walk off that stage, if you will, without picking somebody who is who is a woman of color, rather. Can't do it. So we end up with, long story short, we end up with VP Kamala Harris. And I've argued her age, her, sort of, toughness, I guess. I'm trying to find some positive adjectives for her. But there are these characteristics that I think if you look within the gamesmanship of politics that we oftentimes talk about on this show, the game that goes back and forth, she could be a valuable chess piece, if you will, in the game of politics. But in terms of what she could do for the people at that level, it's hard as a representative to truly be able to do something for the people. But what I believe is within the heart and soul of Kamala Harris for the people, I believe that relationship is kind of lacking, if you will. And these poll numbers sort of signify, the polls aren't like everything, they aren't tremendously important, but the poll numbers sort of signify, if you will, the idea that she has not moved in the right direction. Never mind what the actual numbers are. The fact that she hasn't moved to be more favorable with the people means that the Democrats have some things to think about here. As I said, Joe Biden is not going to reset his age. He is still going to be 83 years old the next time he is running for and takes office, running for president and is sworn in. 83 years old. Ooh, it's just a lot, So the Democrats got to figure out something to do with that. Let me know what you think about Kamala Harris as well as we get through this. Like, I ask another, I kind of have another question in mind, which is like, who's next up? Like, if it's not Kamala Harris, like who would folks out there like to see not just run for president, but I'm talking about down ballot races as well. Who would you like to see in leadership? Because there's not really a strong bullpen, to use a baseball analogy, that the Democrats have at this moment. And that could be a problem. We talked a little bit about folks, like yesterday we talked about Cori Bush, Representative Cori Bush out of Missouri, who was elected post, everything that happened in, Ferguson, Missouri with with Michael Brown and the protests that followed and the movement that followed. Cori Bush kind of comes out of that. You have Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez up in New York, who, of course, unseated a longtime Democrat that had held that seat up there, I think, in the Long Island section of New York for a long time. She comes in and she's a radical, right? She's constantly questioning things. You have Rep. Ilhan Omar, her existence seems to piss off a lot of conservatives in this country, which is always an interesting thing. You have these figures like this across the country who have slowly been, finding their way to Congress in the last 4 to 5 years. And so to say that, okay, Congress is entirely awash, there's nobody that's, redeemable within this body and that we should kind of reset and start over is not entirely true, right? Like we're not entirely doomed. We do have these individuals, but they still represent a minority of thought here, a minority of culture within the chamber, which typically seems to be locked into this idea of fighting with each other, left versus right, Democrats versus Republicans, and that is really the core of the argument. When I dive into this Kamala Harris thing and I'm trying to figure out why is this even important, because I have other conversations about people like Hillary Clinton, right? When she ran for president in 2016, what I said was that who cares how much we like her? She's a better candidate than the other person who's running for president. She's better at what the job is asking for than the other person. That should have been number one, right? So when we come back around to this conversation about likability, And I say, where does likability find its way into this conversation relevantly? And that's where I'd say it is. Kamala Harris might be able to do the job well, but within the gamesmanship, within the game that we play here, she doesn't have much value unless she can play the role, unless she can be likable, unless she can be something that the Democrats want and something that the Republicans also wouldn't mind. So, a window where Joe Biden finds himself right now. If we are constantly sort of expecting that the most successful politicians on either side of the aisle are simply going to be the best at fitting within a mold that has already been obviously cut. That's what a mold is. But, you know, if we're saying the best politicians are the ones that can fit most neatly within the mold, then we are not going to get the new outside of the box ideas that we want in this country. We're not going to get that from a legislative perspective, and the culture around those ideas won't form either if we continually say to ourselves the best people for us in leadership are the ones that can fit within the mold. Some of those names I mentioned before: Cori Bush, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib is another one. These are some of the names that fit outside of that box. These are some of the names that ought to be filtering through the system. Right now, the Democrats don't have that, still don't have that person that they can reach into the bag and pull up and say, hey, this is our next young person. It doesn't necessarily have to be a young person, but this is our next person that we have up that we believe could lead the party. They don't have that. So this whole Vice President Harris conversation is not a conversation that I bring up so that we can sling some mud and rocks at a person who's already not very popular. No reason to do that. What happens with Harris will happen, right? But what we ought to be thinking about is, if we find ourselves on this side of the aisle, and I know a lot of people out there might not call themselves Democrats or Republicans like me. I'm an independent, whatever that means. But if you find yourself in this mode of, I would like the situation in front of me to be better, and I would like the people who represent us to do better, we don't get tunneled into the conversation about how much we hate or love Kamala Harris. We take a step back and realize Kamala Harris is a chess piece in a game that we don't want to play anymore. We want to fold the board up and we want to play. We want to do something else. We don't want to play the game. We don't want to elect leaders that only appear to be good for us. We want leaders that actually are good for us. And if that kind of thing is not available, then we'll do it ourselves. I know that sounds kind of a radical idea, but I think that as millennials, and I've said this before, but as millennials sort of find their way to the tops, not of, you know, the most prestigious positions in society, but the decision-making positions in society. As younger people find their way into those systems, I think those systems are breaking down at very key and important parts. This is important, because it might not look like that now. The leadership might not look like that now, but in time, soon the culture won't allow for this sort of backwards, stagnant thinking that we have in politics right now. It does relate to some topics that we discussed a little bit earlier this week, too, in terms of the formation of two Americas that is inevitably coming because of what we've seen with COVID and what we've seen with vaccine rollout or lack thereof, in a sense. This headline coming from Politico: Biden rolls out aggressive plan to jumpstart vaccination. What does this have to do with anything? I read this earlier and I said, uh-oh, this is the part in the movie where this is the part in the post-apocalyptic film where like the intense music starts. Dun, 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 dun. You know, like this is where it gets real, where the president issues this declaration. Now, in the movies, it's usually a lot more black and white because they usually don't have enough time to explain the fall of a normal democracy into whatever it is, the chaos that happens in post-apocalyptic movies. They usually don't have enough time to sort of explain that. But if you watch those kind of movies, that's kind of at what point we are in right now. We are at the point of, we still have a society, we still have rules, we still have everything else like that, but things are about to get real different because that's what the situation calls for. Now, earlier this week, I talked about how we're moving towards becoming a country that has vaccine mandates. That's a strong term and a title that is going to be refuted legislatively all across the country, especially in conservative states, especially in the Midwest, especially in the South. Yes, I'm looking at you, southern states, not doing too well with this kind of thing. That's where the lowest vaccination numbers are right now, and it's where also, not so coincidentally, where the highest infection rates are as well in these states that are pushing back against the term vaccine mandates even before vaccine mandates actually reach the United States. We talked about that earlier this week. Now, we've been seeing this week as this conversation is kind of spread out across the land, if you will, that it does make people uncomfortable. That there's a lot of people that are like, look, we'll go into the mode where we are forced, that the government or some agency is forcing us in one way, shape, or form to get the vaccine. There's a lot of optics that don't seem to play well with the American way if you consider those kind of things, right? It just doesn't line up all the time. But anyway, it's happening in states and in smaller entities across the United States. And finally, today, President Joe Biden, of course, gave this directive that will require 2 million federal employees to disclose whether they've been vaccinated against COVID-19 or they have to submit to regular testing. We've seen a little bit of this in France. We talked about it last week or the week before, 2 weeks ago. We talked about in France that you have to have these vaccine passports to access certain things like trains and nightclubs and movies and stuff like that. And how would that impact the United States when it gets here? This is the beginning of it, as I said. Federal workers, according to Politico.com, federal workers and on-site contractors will have to attest to their vaccination status as well. Those who don't must wear masks at work, regardless of their geographic location, and get tested once or twice a week for COVID-19. Employees who don't disclose being fully vaccinated also will be subject to work travel restrictions and must physically distance from colleagues and visitors, the administration said. So they are not playing around. Now, this is also the federal government that we're talking about here, too. So we're not talking about just the physical buildings that exist in and around Washington, D.C. This is federal workers, period. If you collect a check from the federal government, you are a federal worker. Now, I don't know how that works with, mail delivery. We actually just had this conversation about mail delivery and federal initiatives the other day. But anything that qualifies as a federal job, or if you work on in a facility that's a federal facility, guess what? These are your new rules. These are your new rules. Now, there's going to be a lot of people who do not like this. There are people who are going to refuse, even people who work for the government. There's a lot of people who are anti-government that work for the government. It's just the weird world that we live in anyway. But anyway, this is going to set up an interesting situation because nobody's being forced here. Nobody's being forced. The government, but the federal government is saying, look, I don't care what y'all do. We talked about this earlier. We're not going to be able to legislatively force you. We're not going to be able to put a mandate down. We've already seen a resistance to that. So we can't do that. So we'll just set a shining example, right? We sit at the top of the mountain. We are the most influential single entity, regarding this. We're the most single influential entity that can set a precedent for something to happen on this. And so this is what we're going to do. And that has a tremendous impact everywhere else. It's a lot of the strategy that I wanted the Trump administration. I didn't think we were going to get it from the Trump administration, and we didn't. But this is what I wanted from the Trump administration. I wanted them to say, look, we're not going to force you, because it just didn't seem on brand for them, right? We're not going to force you to wear masks. We're not going to force you to establish social distancing rules and regulations for your local town or whatever else like that. We're not going to force you to do that. However, what I wanted out of the last administration, at the very least, the last presidential administration, I wanted them to set an example. Set an example of responsibility first. What we saw from the last administration was a releasing of, I always called it like the Pontius Pilate, washing of the hands. He said, look, I don't know what's going to happen with you all individually in this COVID thing, but it's up to the states, it's up to the governors, it's up to local governments to establish what rules and regulations are appropriate to get us through this COVID thing. And the federal government was very light, if existing at all, on the idea of setting a federal precedent for what we should do during COVID. And at the very least, I wanted them to do what the Biden administration is doing now. I'm not saying I'm for it or against it, but the idea of the action of leadership during a time like this is important. You can't throw your hands up and say, you guys figure out what's best for you. I'll be back here if you guys have any questions. And by the way, if you have any questions, I'm still not going to answer them. I'm just going to be back here. Like, that's not a good approach to take, no matter which side of the political aisle you're on. This situation, as I've said time and time and time again, is above any sort of political tilt one way or the other. There are a lot of things that we need to do regarding COVID that have nothing, and I repeat, nothing to do with what side of the political aisle you are on, which means that a move like this could really injure Joe Biden's chances, or not chances, rather, it could really injure his popularity. It could really injure his favorability and his numbers a year outside of the midterm election, which we'll get into in a second. But that's okay. During this time, it's not always about trying to be or trying to represent the best version of self. Right now, it's not time to put your own political interests ahead of what might be best for the country. This is going to hurt Joe Biden. Yes. And this is going to start this is also rather going to start a rolling conversation at the state level and at the local level as well about what they are then willing to do. Look at what the federal government did. They required all their employees to be vaxxed. And if they're not vaxxed, they got to show that they're negative of COVID. They have to do that regularly on a weekly basis. Now, that is a standard. We have to, at the state level, we have to at least start there. And guess what? The state governments and the governors and the local officials and things, they're going to have to deal with the same sort of scrutiny that Joe Biden is kind of going to deal with because of this. They're going to be people that are saying, "Oh, mandates? I thought this is America." I mean, I could see it now. I could see the protests forming outside of stores and businesses everywhere, employees with signs hanging around their neck that says "no poke, no joke" or something, something that rhymes or something that's cute that they'll put on a sign. But it's happening. It's going to happen. And there's going to be all these challenges that are going to say, well, is Joe Biden a good leader if these people are pouring out into the streets and refuting these examples? I mean, it's so obvious to me if you can't see this coming. And maybe not. But I'm here to put you on that that's what we're going to see in the next couple of months. I promise you. But if it means that we are a step closer, or that we are going to slow down the spread of this most recent variant of COVID-19, then so be it. We talked about likability and favorability with Kamala Harris, related to Kamala Harris. Well, look, being cool and being everyone's friend is sometimes not a part of what you need to do as president. I don't care how cool you were or are as a president. It's about leadership. If you're a bad leader, it's hard for me to categorize you. It's hard for me to say that I have faith that you're going to do a good job next time. Whatever that next time is. So I think a lot of thought on my end goes into that. Like, likability in politics, sure, is a tough thing to keep balanced. It's a part of the game of politics that we talk about all the time. But sometimes you got to do things like this. Sometimes you got to step out on a limb and say, I'm going to do something that people really aren't going to like at all. It's best. It's what we have to do. Let me know what you think about vaccine mandates. I asked this question a little bit earlier as well about, like, do you think that America will ever be accepting of a vaccine mandate in any sort of way, shape, or form? This is not something that America necessarily has a choice in terms of the federal mandate. And if you don't work for the federal government, then this directly does not affect you. But if you are working at a company right now that is, let's say, planning on returning to physical office space within the next month or two, this very well could be an issue that you're dealing with. I mean, we had healthcare workers. I thought this was a very fascinating topic, but we had healthcare workers that were resisting, in some instances, the requirement that, they had to get vaccinated in order to return to work in some parts of this country, California, Texas, the VA hospital as well, which is another federal entity as well that required their workers to do so. So not here in Pennsylvania just yet, but that's a question that, I would think to myself, if I'm working in healthcare, I would think that I would definitely want to be vaccinated. I don't know if there would need to be much motivation to get me vaccinated, working constantly with, people who are sick or people who could potentially be sick, with COVID. Sign me up, prick it up. Let's do it. But that's just me. Obviously, not everyone feels that way, but let me know what you think in the comment section about any of these mandates, any of these requirements that are coming down, and if you think that it's going to cause, some uncomfortable tension in this country, which I do think that it will. Legal challenges for sure, but uncomfortable tension in this country, most def. Real quick, some news yesterday. Not news. I guess I asked this question yesterday. On the show and a little bit before the show, I got some more responses. So we got actually a lot more responses to this question than I thought. But the question was, how much money do you need? Now, here's the question. Just listen to the question for a second. How much money do you need a month to live your dream lifestyle? And this is going to require you maybe to go write some things down or write some notes in your phone or whatever else like that and give some ballpark figures as to how much you think you need to live your dream lifestyle. But I promise you, whatever number that you come up with at the end of this exercise will surprise you. It is probably going to be lower than you would expect. I made the argument yesterday that you can, of course, this number could be unlimited. Like, once you really start thinking about it, there's not a good reason to cap yourself at anything. But when you think about what you really need to live a dream lifestyle, it's not as much as you might think. I think yesterday I came up with somewhere between like $3,000 and $4,000 a month for me individually. Somebody else brought up a good point. My buddy Russ brought up a good point in saying that, look, I don't know about the monthly in terms of the monthly expense, month over month cost, but there's certainly a lot of upfront costs that are associated with living your dream lifestyle too. So your dream lifestyle, you might say, is best lived in a house. I'm going to, live in a house on an island. That's my best life. That's my dream lifestyle. So $4,000 a month after I already have a house in like a boat or something. I don't know what else would you need on an island? I'd have to think about that, but maybe daily pina colada mix. I don't know. Anyway, let me know. Think about it. Let me know what that number is. Our lowest number so far has been $2,000 a month, and our highest number is $100,000 a month. That is definitely the biggest by far, but I'll share some more results later on this week on a Nichols Worth as well. I appreciate folks for joining me on the show tonight. Tomorrow, I will be back at 8 o'clock. Okay, also, tomorrow, while I've got people here, tomorrow is going to be the last show of the week, obviously, but starting on Monday, I will be on WURD radio for the next couple of weeks, covering the midday for my good buddy Nick Taliaferro out in Philly. I will still physically be here, but of course, if you guys want to check out what's happening after that, starting next week for the next 3 weeks, we'll be doing our thing from, of course, 96.1 FM Word Radio in Philadelphia. So I'll have all the streaming information. If you're watching on the Instagram, you'll be able to tune in there as well and be a part of some of those conversations there. If you're listening on another outlet, we'll have links and everything else like that from there. So once again, starting on Monday, we'll be on Word Radio Monday through Thursday, and we'll do a wrap-up show right here on Friday for a Nichols Worth, because I know you, the people, need your Nichols Worth. At least I like to think that you need your Nichols Worth. But anyway, I appreciate folks for joining us at Keaton D. Nichols on the socials. That's where you can catch me on the Instagram. Anchor.fm/A Nichols Worth is your podcast home. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch, all the same. Until tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I will see everybody later. Until then, stay safe.